I think that's one of the beauties of Jewish prayer is that it meets you wherever you are, and you are not the same person that you were. The words remain the same, but the person praying doesn't.
Good morning, Andi.
Hi, Nechama.
I'm excited to be here. I feel like we have a lot of things to talk about. I really want to get started talking about prayer and specifically the prayers we're saying these days for the well-being of the soldiers, of the hostages, of those who are in need of prayer for healing. We're coming off of Shabbat where we spend praying the mishaberach for the chayalim, the special prayers that are said for the well-being take on a certain fervency. I've lived here for 32 years, and we say them every week, and suddenly you're in a war, and it sounds very different. Can you talk a little bit about where your art meets prayers for the soldiers?
This story begins not so much with the war, but when my oldest son went into the army, and suddenly I had a combat soldier on my hands. Okay, so my oldest son is in tanks and my youngest son is in paratroopers. I didn't grow up with that ethos of course you go into the army and your father was in the army and your grandfather was in the army, and I didn't grow up with that. For me, prayer is very personal and there's something very comforting about the repetition of it. And as I find with all the prayers in, our liturgy, depending on what you're going through, they become suddenly more relevant, less relevant, or a section of the prayer speaks out to you much, much more. So as kind of a way of self-comforting, I said, okay, for every day that I have a son in combat, I'm going to sew a page in a prayer book, the mishaberach, the prayer for the well-being of the soldiers. And that's what's here. This is 6.5 years worth of the same prayer being sewn into this prayer book over and over and over again. The truth is that because of the war and because I have 2 sons and 3 sons-in-laws now fighting, I decided that I would do an addendum to this. So it wouldn't be an extension of this because they're not all my sons, but there's this funny thing that happens when your children fall in love with other people. Their well-being suddenly matters a great deal. And so what I'm doing is I'm having the same mishaberach printed, but the opposite. So the letters are white on black pages, and the bookbinding thread will be red. And however long it takes each of these soldiers to serve for this war, they'll be in this prayer book, and it will be something separate, but something part of this story.
Let me ask you, Sai, where does prayer meet you at this time?
Because I didn't go to day school and because I grew up Reform, I don't have a good grasp of Hebrew. And I tend to approach everything in a very basic kind of pshat, like surface sort of way. So I'm a big prayer, but my own prayer. Like if you ask my kids when I light candles Friday night, like, oh, forget mom, she's going to be over there for an hour and a half. I think that's one of the beauties of Jewish prayer is that it meets you wherever you are, and you are not the same person that you were. Like as you grow older and you lose people, like these prayers, Kaddish, everything is a different prayer. And it isn't that the prayers changed, you've changed.
I'm finding a similar experience. There's a morning blessing. We say 15 blessings in the morning, and there's one that's matir asurim, to release those who are imprisoned. And every day, normally, when I get to those blessings, you kind of go through them pretty quickly. And suddenly that prayer, that line jumps out. And It's no longer rote, and it's no longer amorphous or unrelatable. It's very, very relatable. There's a passage in Pirkei Avot that we were learning yesterday, actually a memory of the D's. There's an amazing project, the Pirkei Avot project, that every Shabbat you learn one of the Mishnayot in the ethics of our fathers. And there are some directed questions, and thousands of people are now learning Pirkei Avot every Shabbat in memory of this family that were cruelly murdered by terrorists around Passover time, a mother and her 2 daughters. And this week, we happen to have read Rabbi Shimon saying, do not let your prayer become fixed. Every time it should be filled with tachanunim and bakashot, right? It should be filled with pleas for compassion, for mercy. And we talked about that complexity of praying a fixed prayer, right? If you're using the prayer book, doesn't matter which denomination, you're saying a fixed prayer several times a day, and there's a tediousness to it and a repetitiveness to it. And what you described, and you said it came out of a place where prayer for you is very personal, you don't have a fixed liturgy, is exactly what Rabbi Shimon says prayer should be, which is when you say it, it should have like a deeper meaning to it. It should have an awareness of this is a language in which we're communicating with God or communicating within ourselves for what we're yearning for. And on one hand, the repetitiveness, the structure of prayer, many people find comforting that every day they get up and they say the same words in the same liturgy, even though it may not have deep meaning every single day, it's there accompanying us throughout our lives. And there are others who find that repetition to be the antithesis of meaningful prayer. And I think even the Mishaberach, right? We talked about for soldiers, every Shabbat you say it, and you kind of, oh yeah, here we're saying another Mishaberach for soldiers. But when you have a son-in-law, or at times of war, suddenly there's nothing routine or rote about it.
I can add one more little anecdote, which is, you know this, but I have a son-in-law who was badly wounded 2 Motzei Shabbats ago, and he lost an eye. And my daughter came home from one of the visits, and she said that he had gone to the bathroom, and he came out and he was saying Asher Yatzar, which, you know, suddenly for someone who's been in a life or death experience, to thank God that everything is working.
The prayer after you go to the bathroom, which we say, how many times a day do we kind of mumble it? And when you're acutely aware of how fragile your body is and that at any moment a piece could stop working, the prayer takes on much more meaning.
So that entire expression just somehow has so much more weight. The words remain the same, but the person praying doesn't.